There we go. Live. Cool. Hello, everybody who's watching. I thought I'd go after Steve Biko for a bit because he's really influential, and Kato over here is providing some nice little details in the comments here and what he said, because for some reason YouTube removes the comments when they're done. Maybe it's because my channel isn't big enough or something. I don't know. But he says here, raised in a poor Xhosa family, Biko grew up in Ginsberg Township in the Eastern Cape. In 1966, he began studying medicine at the University of Natal. Is this the Steve Biko we will be studying today? Yes, it is. As far as I know, there isn't another Steve Biko. National Party government were initially supportive, seeing the creation of South African Students' Organization as a victory for apartheid's ethos of racial separation. Until Biko turned communist. Yeah, that's a fair assessment. But he, even to the end of his life, Biko was sort of had big pressure on socialism. But at the end, he dropped a lot of his racialism and went for the idea that when we get to socialism, there'll be no need for division because everybody will have the material needs they desire, which is, I think it's naive, and I think it's also it ignores human nature, because people require things that are more than just material satisfaction. Wealthy people do silly things to each other as well. So what I will say is that we're in a situation where Biko is one of the most influential people in South Africa's intellectual history. But because most of what he wrote was written when he was in his early 20s, it's pretty sophomore. I mean, like, I know the kind of stuff that I was writing at that time for myself, and I wouldn't show that to anyone. It's terrible. I mean, even the writings on my blog that are from like the last couple of years, if I compare them to serious academics or serious philosophers, they kind of come a bit short. So, but I will be reading one of them, and this is going to be quite controversial. So if you guys, but I mean, I suppose that's probably what people come to me for, as a bit of controversy. So I'm just going to read the article that I wrote, and I wrote this, God, how long ago? I wrote it in June of last year. I was just tired of Steve Biko because I was forced to read him when I was at UCT, and by a rather sort of transparently racist lecturer called Thiven Reddy. And this is the lecturer who oversaw the writing of that thesis by Masatole Mlandu, I don't know if it was the next year or the year after, where he wrote this. He did his honors thesis, and he got a pretty decent mark for arguing that the solution to the settler colonial problem in South Africa would be violent, retributive revolution, and signed it off with one settler, one bullet. And so, to give you that's the kind of caliber of class which I was in which Biko was prescribed reading at UCT. So without more comment, I'm just gonna dive into it. So Steve Bantu Biko is today the most popular South African philosopher. While he was a valiant martyr for the anti-apartheid struggle, his philosophy is not only flawed, it is very bad, and feeds racial hatred and ignorant historical revisionism. For most of my life as a South African, I have been at least tangentially aware of Steve Biko. Having learnt about his life, it is impossible to ignore the man's courage, charisma, and single-mindedness. But having been forced to read his works at university, I can say that they are utter trash. Most of the factual claims he makes are false, his theories are sophomore, his morality is flexible, and his prejudice is deep. Where he is not cynical, he is naive, and where he is not wrong, he is only trivially right. And that could easily describe anyone at 24, the age of Bantu Biko, at the time of having written the bulk of I Write What I Like. It certainly could have described me, a callow, lazy, and entitled communist wannabe, tagging along to protest events for the atmosphere and the hope that something exciting would happen. But since witnessing the mindless groupthink, mendacity, and genocidal rhetoric which billowed out of the tire fires of the fallist protest movement, I was shocked out of my dogmatic slumber and into a newly critical frame of mind. I had the distinct pleasure of being forced by my lecturer to read a collection of texts whose full context served to demonstrate that everybody of my kin was so evil that genocide was too good for us. But in a way, I'm thankful for it. It exposed me to Biko, as well as Frantz Fanon, an actual intellectual who, though flawed, has much to say on matters of race, self-respect, and war. I realize that by attacking a sacred cow like Biko, my only redemption may well be my obscurity and irrelevance, but I think that reality must catch up to South Africa someday, and if I can add a drop of grease to the runway, all the better. Popularity and right are not the same thing. Biko, for any not acquainted with him, was a poor young Xhosa student activist from the University of Natal, and a member of the National Union of South African Students, or NUSAS. We like our pronounceable acronyms here in South Africa, COSATU, NEHAWU, APLA, and so on. Makes easier than belching in alphabet soup every time you have to talk politics. So he was a prominent partisan writer, defending the cause of the students' arm of the struggle against apartheid domination. He rose to prominence within the student movement and became a key organizer of the student uprisings, which themselves were a key domino in the chain reaction which finally toppled apartheid. Just as an aside, if you read, there's a collection of essays written in 1990 about the history of South Africa's education system called Pedagogy of Domination by Mokobunga Nkomo. And it's a fairly left-wing treatise, but it's also fairly detailed. And being South Africa, there's a lot of close to the ground details. And it turns out that there was a lot of talk within the education institutions after the Soweto uprisings, where people sort of said, "Oh, well, clearly the apartheid system doesn't really work for the whole nation, at least in some areas." And the compromise in the education system, where people said, okay, well, it's not going to work here, actually led much of the rest of the civil service to doubt whether it could be applied in general. So at least that was the thesis, and I thought it was quite plausible, but be that as it may. All the while, he wrote a fiery and rhetorically gifted articles, which drew police attention, leading him to be banned and eventually arrested and cruelly martyred. He was beaten to death in his jail cell at the age of 30, leaving behind a wife and child. During his activist days, he was a dynamic and vigorous writer and public speaker. Throughout the 1970s, his movement saw cooperation across the racial boundary in opposition to apartheid, something which carried severe punishments. However, he also encountered a phenomenon all too familiar these days: white liberals. No doubt taking his cue from Malcolm X, Biko recognized that most whites who join the struggle aren't 100% invested in it. Anybody who's met these holier-than-thou types cannot but cringe. Regardless of the sense or reality of a position, if it is radical, if it is pro-black, these folks clamor to show their support, their allyship. But Biko recognized how many of these activists wore their acquaintance with blacks on some kind of fashionable badge to show how enlightened and tolerant they were without taking real risks for what they purported to believe in. Of course, let's be careful here. There were real white radicals, and I think a good example of that would be Breyten Breitenbach, also from my hometown, Wellington. He came up with the idea of an albino terrorist. That one has to one has to see oneself as being part of the black people, and so on, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't really work in the long time, but I got given that. I was told that I had to become that if I wanted to consider myself in any way acceptable to black people. By, of all people, a black American activist, an anti-prison activist who came to join the fallist protest. There were a lot of funny things going on at that time. We can talk about that later, I guess, though. The numerical dominance and greater capacity for political articulation of these white students in the student unions, because of course more white kids at university, led to them dominating the very movement for black liberation in the education sector. Biko quite rightly observed that black people under segregation lacked self-confidence and made serious attempts to foster an autonomous race-based separatism in political organization. However, his early critique lacked the capacity for nuance. In order to make the argument that on no account can any white person be trusted or cooperated with, he chose to slander the liberal activist Alan Paton and accuse him of defending apartheid while sitting in state-mandated exile in London. This, I suppose, was to have the effect of demonstrating that even the most well-meaning whites were not capable of escaping a supremacist consciousness. Unfortunately, Paton caught wind of this, because Paton read everything, and published a rebuttal, refusing the quote attributed to him. It's a fascinating little exchange, because it is also an entertainingly facile refutation of Biko's pretentious neo-Hegelian arguments for black power. Now, I just have to interrupt you because I didn't explain it in the essay. But if you're not familiar with Georg Hegel, he was a German philosopher and he was the precursor to Karl Marx. And he basically came up with this idea that history follows a dialectic between opposing forces. And so you'll have a dominant power and an opposing power, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So that means in the ancient Greek rhetoric, a thesis just means I'm saying this is what I'm making a claim about, an argument about. And so Hegel sort of made that the whole political system was a thesis, the whole cultural system, all the values in society, that's the thesis, right? And so what happens is someone starts critiquing it, and that's the antithesis. And then what happens is after conflict, there's a new synthesis emerges, and you have a new synthetic system. And then that new synthetic system becomes the thesis, and you repeat ad infinitum. So what Steve Biko says here about this is basically Biko heard the Hegelian idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis as the mechanism of historical progress, digested it uncritically, and regurgitated a highly simplified version of it, which goes like this. White supremacy, apartheid and colonialism, is the thesis. The antithesis is black power. And the synthesis will be a more fully human society. This turn of phrase is an interesting one. Reading through I Write What I Like, Biko's observations on white culture are that whites are barely human. Incapable of emotional expression, musical appreciation, dance, or mutual affection. A mass of soulless, alien parasites with no redeeming qualities except capitalist efficiency. He then goes on to detail how gentle, intelligent, compassionate, and culturally rich his own people are, pointing out that Indians and coloreds have some of this quality, and that by including themselves within a black consciousness, they will benefit from the positive influence of African culture. And only by embracing the African culture, he reasons, can the white settlers become truly human. So this diatribe, which has all the sensitivity of a colonial tribal field guide, casts his little Hegelian syllogism into perspective. What he's really arguing for is black supremacy, which is, of course, what is now emerging under the decolonial movement in South Africa. A major feature of black consciousness is the idea that white and black should not organize or struggle together, but remain active only in their own communities, taking cues from the demands of black leaders. What Alan Paton warns is that the synthesis Biko speaks of is just as likely to be war. Pitting two races against each other in a mortal power struggle bears no resemblance to a rational exchange of scientific theories. Biko's analysis, while bad, should not be given the credit of mere logical inconsistency. His historical illiteracy is just as important. His claim that Europeans are uniquely cruel to blacks may have some basis as a vague generalization if you're not all that well read, but feeling the need to underscore it with a historical counterexample, Biko declares that the worst that has happened from any war between European nations has been a bit of ethno-linguistic admixture. This, coming from a man born after the Second World War, is such unbelievable tripe it ought to count as comedy. Nevertheless, Biko's writings remain the most stolen library book in the country, and his writings are raised aloft by the same preening white middle-class hypocrites that they were meant to criticize. While Anglo elites and guilt-ridden Afrikaner meisies ingratiate themselves with a perverse sense of moral superiority by embracing the moral codes of intersectionalism, which demand an unconditional supplication and surrender of authority and autonomy to the demands, declarations, and wants of those with the label of oppressed, the vast majority of white South Africans are, just practically speaking, unlikely to find the capacity within themselves to sacrifice the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. If the current generation of political youth leaders, raised on the segregationism of Steve Biko, the absolutist essentialism of Kimberlé Crenshaw, and the valorization of slaughter found in Frantz Fanon, make their way into high office, I can imagine there will be little happy synthesis. The most pernicious aspect of the black consciousness ideology in practice, however, seems to be what it does to non-white minorities. In his little political caste system, black means anyone struggling against the whites. By identifying with the African struggle, you dissolve your identity and submit yourself to the cause. If you waver or betray the movement, you are merely non-white. What this means practically, and I've witnessed this firsthand, is that racism against colored or Indian minorities, or the more persecuted African minorities like the Tsonga, must just be calmly tolerated, since standing up for oneself against the movement or differing politically results in one losing one's blackness, one's full humanity. You have to engage in really subtle, silly linguistic trickery in order to try and get away with a criticism of the movement. It's very, very circular and narrow. I suppose the main redeeming feature of Biko, aside from his obvious testicular fortitude, is that he didn't stay 24 forever. Much of the racial absolutism of his student union articles disappeared by the time he gave his final interview, where it appears he had shifted to a non-racial socialism, even remarking, perhaps optimistically, that once socialism and economic equality were achieved, race would cease to be an issue. His basic theories have not changed, but he had acquired a nuance not seen in his early articles compiled in his most famous work. However, this will not save the subjects of his undead theory. One of the more ironic consequences is the barrier it creates to native language intellectual development. The Africanists hit a wall in the decolonial protests in 2015. While many students wished to no longer express themselves in European languages, the lack of mutual intelligibility across the language barriers forced them into using English exclusively. The continuity of the traditional resistance to Afrikaans as a medium of instruction has been the last nail in the coffin for Afrikaans tertiary education. This has created the ironic situation where no university in South Africa can now have a medium of instruction but English. And I observed that a fair number of black South Africans have already lost true native fluency, being much more fluent in the lingua franca English. This loss of the function that universities provide as an institution for reproducing rich and deep cultural expression and knowledge is now cementing the hegemony of the language of the former oppressor and reducing a complex patchwork of cultural heritage to the same homogeneous mass the apartheid system designated them as: blacks. So basically Biko is a racist. That's well spotted, Patrick. But I wouldn't hold it against him. Everyone in South Africa is a little bit racist. I think the big problem is, let me go up and let's start with the comments first, and then I'll move on to some other interesting things, because I've got, I'd like to read you, actually, it's very short. After I've done a few questions, I'd like to read you actually what Paton wrote, because it's really fun. He just dismembers Biko's whole philosophy in like a couple of sentences. It's fantastic. And then I'll read you what Biko actually wrote about cultural differences, and you can hear what I mean. It's like really like crude and stereotyped. But anyway, so Cato, managerial elite toaster, hello again, nice to see you. They're not bad. I don't know what you mean, but yes. So Muhluri Hanyane, why is he an important figure to study? How much influence does he have in his work in the current political sphere? Well, as I said in the article, he's the most stolen library book in South Africa. Now, that's quite something. A lot of young black people are interested in him, and he's sort of got a sacred figure. Like, nobody criticizes him in academia in South Africa. It doesn't matter how bad his history is. It doesn't matter how sort of intellectually dishonest he gets when he's attacking his political opponents. He doesn't receive any criticism, and he can be really brutally sort of reductionist in how he looks at other races, and he can be very disrespectful, but he's not criticized for it. It's just like, well, they don't treat him as a human being. They treat him as like a vaunted angelic saint. And so the thing is, people like to say that, I mean, like what Quentin Ferreira said in that one famous article of his, where he said, "We live in the eternal apartheid." That's very real in the student and academic areas, and consequently for journalists and politicians, because what they'll say is like nothing has changed since apartheid. That is constant. People just keep saying that nothing's changed since apartheid. Nothing's changed since 1975, 1984. Doesn't matter which year they pick for their little rhetorical point. They'll say nothing has changed. And of course, this is a complete lie. I mean, the country is completely unrecognizable. There's nothing. There's almost nothing left of the old system. They really have to hunt in corners to look for it. I mean, look, you can see it in the fact that we still have the 4 racial categories. You can see it in the fact that we still have. You can still see the infrastructure that they built that affects, the city geography. But the way that people are criticizing apartheid never seems to have anything to do with undoing the system that came before it, so much as taking revenge in effigy upon the living for the crimes of the dead. And I don't see a lot of virtue in that sort of I don't see a lot of virtue in this. What else have we got? Cato saying, exposed you and immunized your intellect, much like a good vaccine protects one from the destruction of a virulent attack. Yeah, I would say that. I mean, the thing is that I was a classical Marxist. I really believed in that very sort of universal idea of human liberation, and what really sort of put a barrier for me was that the way that people were using Steve Biko, because they were saying, okay, nothing's changed, it meant that we had to apply the same strategies as Steve Biko applied to talk about cultural reform and so on and so forth. And so they said that, I remember early on in the Rhodes Must Fall protests, they had it was open to everyone. Anyone could come and take part. Very, very open and tolerant, and everyone was just trying to hear new ideas and say things that were, and air grievances and so on. And they went anything from the silly to the serious to the sane to the insane. Very, very broad dialogue for the first month or so. And then it sort of narrowed down quite a bit, because once they actually won the decision in the University Senate to have the statue taken down, the tone changed, because everyone was kind of saying, well, the movement's about more than the statue, but they had no idea what they believed. There were some people who did, and those people ended up dragging the crowd along with them. And I remember the last meeting where white people were allowed to take part during the Rhodes Must Fall period. This is like March, April sort of region, 2015. And I was present there, and I remember them doing this because there were a lot of anarchists around, and the anarchists, they were some of the earliest people to show up in the movement and do things, and they were all the anarchist collective. These are people who'd never read a piece of anarchist literature. They just sort of vaguely hung out in that cafe on Lower Main Road Observatory and smoked a lot of dope, went to a lot of trance parties, had a lot of money because they're quite wealthy. So but they were looking for something to do, and they joined the Flawless Movement. They were like the first people to join it. And so the influence they had was that everyone in the group was talking about having no leaders. They're going to have a flat organization where everybody's equal and there's going to be no leaders or anything like that, no structure. It doesn't work out, because what happens in the meetings is that you have one or two very strong personalities and who will dominate the meeting and end up behaving like a chairperson. It was the person who dominated early on for like that first little while was this very bright, very sharp girl who was part of student representative council. She was a Tswana girl. I think her name was Mase. She did a lot of the chairing of a lot of the meetings, but there was pressure from a lot of people to say, no, we don't want this to be an ANC thing, because if for anyone who doesn't know, the student movements, there's different political parties, and the ANC's surrogate party is something called SASCO, and she was the big brand holder in SASCO, but much more prominent than her at sort of a visibility level was Ramabina. Ramabina was the big orator who convinced the Senate, who were totally against removing the statue, after having a speech from him that it was almost unanimous. There were only 3 people who held out. So he's a very charismatic man. And he had, I mean, this is a man with a very complicated life that needs not going into, but he was always very charismatic. And I'll give him this much: of all of the Fallist leaders, whenever I encountered him or spoke to him, he always spoke to me like an equal, and he talked to me with respect, despite what he was involved in. So I'm not going to I mean, look, I believe in sort of a bit of mutual respect and honor amongst opponents. You maybe, even if you're fighting to the death, it costs you nothing to be respectful and polite, So I don't know. I think caution, respect. But what happened in these movements, the last one I was in, so I stood up and I was listening to people talking about this, that, and the other. What are we about? What do we mean? And I'd noticed that a lot of the press were picking up on like a few negative features of the movement, because you got to remember, back in 2015, the South African press was a lot more liberal than they are now. Now they're quite clearly socialist. And so there were still people reporting on misbehavior by the students, not often, but occasionally. And there were very vicious, vocal radicals around. And I said, well, you don't want them to characterize the movement. Why don't you just pick someone who can represent the movement to the press, just so that you can filter the press out and control them and say, this is our line, this is what we say. And then I said, maybe even a treasurer, because there's going to be donations, we can manage this kind of stuff, whatever. The next person who gets up doesn't even address me face to face, doesn't even make eye contact, nothing. They stand up and they say, we can't change our movement or whatever because we can't have outsiders dictating to us how to run our revolution. I remember that comment quite clearly. The next day, no white people were allowed in the movement. And I don't know if it was because of me or because of like some conversation that happened before some other time, but it was literally the next day they had announced no more white people. And they used Steve Biko as a justification. So Steve Biko has a very deep impact. Everyone thinks in terms of his categories. And you can look at colored people like Lester Kivitt, is a journalist, commentator kind of guy, and Eusebius McKaiser. They're very big on this Biko blackness vibe. So it ends up disowning your heritage as a colored person. Colored is a very broad category, and there are lots of subgroups that are those were even erased by the colored identity. And so this constant rehomogenization, where people lose contact with their identity and their history. I mean, who remembers the Korana? Who knows how many people left identify as Griqua? How many people left identify as Basters, or so on and so forth? So this Biko blackness erases a lot of identity issues with I supported Rhodes Must Fall initially, and when they started getting racist, I started getting hairy about this, and I thought, like, okay, but this is a problem. Why are we doing this? This is racism, and you can't treat us differently. We're human beings, and I still have a capacity to make observations, and I'm doing everything in good faith. How's it, Renati? How are you doing? The whole vibe there was that they were absolutely intolerant. It was immediately, it's like the cage came down, and me making even mild criticisms of this lot got me in enormous hot water with different people. And I was shunned by tons of people who I thought were friends. And the kind of vitriol that came out of people when you say, no, this is not right, this is not wrong, this is whatever. People would explode at you, and you'd think, like, these are people who you've spent afternoons together laughing, smoking joints, frying pancakes, the usual student stuff. And then the next day you make a comment and they explode at you in the most insane, it was almost like demonic possession. And yeah, it was very, very nasty. There's a lot of death threats and intimidation floating around at the time. And yeah, I mean, look, I wasn't a big shot at the time. I was just irritating to people, you know. Essay's version of Jordan Peterson. It's funny you say that. I found I bumped into Jordan Peterson back in 2016 when it was happening, because I was talking to a fella from the psychology department. He recommended me Jordan Peterson. I was like, what's going on with this? And so Jordan Peterson, I found Jordan Peterson at that time, and the thing is, I was wrestling a lot with how to manage my emotional response to this kind of thing, because it's very easy to fall out of the universalist mold and go all racist and so on. And actually listening to Jordan Peterson kept me away from thinking in that direction, because it was, for a bunch of reasons, but I won't mention them. Let's just check that I'm up to date with the thingamajiggies. Rhodes was a douche, and I also support Rhodes must fall. Okay. Do you know why? What reasons do you have for saying that Rhodes was a douche? What exactly did he do? Do you know? This is the kind of thing that I kind of think is worth paying attention to, because people are going to say, I look at it now, and there was no discussion of what Rhodes actually did. Everyone just said, well, he's a colonialist. And that was the end of the story. And there wasn't much of a public debate, actually. It was all about how we felt. It was all about how do we feel? What was our emotion? What did our feelings tell us about the statue? And it's like, bruh, what are you on about? Concentration camps, freedom wars, mining conglomerates. Concentration camps. My friend, that was Lord Kitchener. I think you're getting a little confused. But you could talk about his labor policies in Kimberley regarding his workers. You could talk about how he micromanaged them in those strange little company towns that he built. That's an option. You could talk. Didn't he donate money to build UCT or something like that? Yes, he did. He bequeathed his will, because he was a lot of people regard him as having been a homosexual, and so he had no progeny to leave his wealth to. So he said he left it to a trust to build things, and so there's a lot of resentment at UCT for him, because it's like, this guy founded us, and so there's like a profound hatred. They can't accept the whole institution. They're going to be raging against the very thing that they're working with for eternity, and it's going to drive them mad. I think if you're going to have, if your institution is to survive, you have to accept what founded it, and deal with that. Rejecting your foundations, the human psychology doesn't allow. Jamison raid, that's substance. That's substance. But I don't believe that's warrant enough for the statue to come down. I let myself be bullied into it, but I look at that now and I say, you know what, I don't care. You've got statues to people like King Shaka in this country. You got statues to Winnie Mandela. Honestly, I don't have a problem with them putting up those statues. I don't care that those people did nasty things. They're being honored for their contribution to history. And sure, you can even make the argument that they're evil. But why would you want to tear it down? What's the point? What does that achieve? Where does this end? You've got we know where this ends. This is nonsense. Every time this is happening, you're allowing a tiny minority of living people to make decisions for all the people that will live for the rest of time. It's not fair. You don't get to make that kind of decision. Certainly you will be forced to make certain decisions that will affect posterity, and everyone's waking decision will have some butterfly effect on the rest of time. But, you have a responsibility to preserve what is. And as far as I'm concerned, even the renamings that the ANC have done of various streets, if someone waved a magic wand and made me God Emperor, I'd leave those names exactly as they are. It is what it is. disturbing the sediment is just, I don't think there's a huge amount of point in doing that kind of stuff. There would have to be a very specific instance that would convince me to remove this, that, or the other, you know. Hiding friends in mines and not black workers. Apologize, Kitchener. You're right, sir. Jamison Raid. Of course, this is not personal opinion and feelings towards him. Yeah, I mean, look, you're perfectly entitled to hate the bugger. I mean, there's plenty of reason to do so. There's plenty of reason to judge him negatively and judge him morally for the actions he's done. I mean, I wouldn't say that Jamison. This is the thing that people forget. There's a distinction between great men and good men, you know, and certainly you can't deny that you can't deny that Rhodes was a great man. Can't call him a good man, but certainly very, very big. He did things of great stature, great impact, and trying to erase him and turn him into some kind of permanent hate effigy. The thing is that we know also that taking people's historical figures and making them what about Hitler? Yeah, feel the same way. What's done is done. If there's still if there's still monuments that are built by the Nazi Party left over, just leave them be. Who cares? It's over now. We can't keep using figures of history to puppeteer the living through this kind of stuff. I don't believe so. And I mean that universally. I just leave it alone. There is certainly something different about people walking around with certain symbols, you know, using certain symbols in a political context. That tells you exactly what they're saying. And you have to. I'm not a free speech absolutist. I don't think you have to be tolerant of people who are in some symbolic way threatening your existence. You don't have to tolerate that at all. In fact, you probably shouldn't, because the more you let it go on, the worse it gets. These things tend to gather steam. And it's kind of what we've been observing now is all of this like one settler, one bullet stuff, you know, it gathers steam and you don't challenge it. You know, eventually you're looking at people who call for genocide coming outside your children's school and saying, you know, now is the time for reckoning, and you know, bow down and worship us, etc. You know, and I just don't do that. I'm not for that. I don't think it's acceptable. So, you know, and I don't think anyone should be either, regardless of who you are. Don't take shit. Don't take shit from people. But I mean, the dead, what shit? Yeah, like what? Yeah, we take that shit seriously. Yeah, you should take it seriously. But dead people, what are you doing? Like getting rid of people trying to rewrite history. Well, you know, it's always they enter history with like a preconception and saying like, well, this is what I intended to be. Just don't. Why? Just look, figure out what is, and then bring that back and say, well, what can we learn? That's about it. But most people go into history looking for things that will defend their existing worldview, and there's no point in that. I'm going to give you an example. Like actually, let me see if I can share screen. I haven't done it on the service before, so oh, do come on. What is going on? Is this sharing screen? Let me see. Share screen to see others later. Close tip. I'm going to figure out. There we go. Share entire screen and application window. There we go. Okay. So let me just zoom in. So it's called Some African Cultural Concepts, and so this is an essay by Steve Biko, and he goes into it and says like how Bantu life is different from white people, and so he talks about how weird it is that that the Institute of Race Relations is. I mean, like this whole section here. He says one of the most difficult things to do these days is talk to authority and anything to do with African culture. Somehow Africans are not expected to have any deep understanding of their own culture, even of themselves. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's pretty accurate at the time. Of course, part of the problem is that the number of black people in South Africa who had education, who could afford to educate themselves enough to do that kind of writing, were in the minority. But it's an interesting comment he makes about this: the feeding habits of urban Africans. Now, what the Institute of Race Relations is trying to do then is to try and go, well, how badly is their nutrition affected by the current government policy? So they can have a basis for criticism, because they're a liberal group. So it's what they do. Lots of very gentle, patient criticism of existing structures. So, but the thing that he does is, of course, there's the unfortunate date. Like, again, it's white people are a curse. Our very existence here is a curse. We can't even be like a neutral occurrence. Like, think about the way that English people talk about the Norman conquest, or the Roman conquest, or the invasion of the Saxons. These are not things that they sit trying to undo in retrospect. They don't try and dig through that past and come up with some way of undoing it, not even down to like the Glorious Revolution or anything like that. So where they were taken over by a Dutch monarchy. So the different way in which these people look at it. I mean, there was a period of time in which the English did look at it this way, and they referred to what happened to their culture as being the Norman yoke, like the yoke that you hang over a kettle. And so there was a fair amount of Saxon and peasant resistance to the French aristocracy that ruled England for a while, but eventually they just blended in. But there's a bit here. Let me see if I can find it. You can the second that you get him comparing the Westerners' culture and the African culture, you get some interesting stuff. So he says, in fact, in traditional African culture, there's no such thing as two friends. Conversation groups are more or less naturally determined by age and division of labor. Thus, one would find all boys whose job it was to look after cattle periodically meeting at popular spots to engage in conversation about their cattle, girlfriends, parents, heroes, etc. All commonly shared their secrets, joys, and woes. No one felt unnecessarily an intruder into someone else's business. The curiosity manifested was welcome. It came out of a desire to share. This pattern one would find in all age groups. House visiting was always a feature of the elderly folks' way of life. No reason was needed as a basis for visits. All part of the deep concern for each other. These things are never done in the Westerner's culture. A visitor to someone's house, with the exception of friends, is always met with the question, "What can I do for you?" This attitude to see people not as themselves but as agents for some particular function, either to one's disadvantage or advantage, is foreign to us. We are not a suspicious race. We believe in the inherent goodness of man. We enjoy man for himself. We regard our living together not as an unfortunate mishap warranting endless competition amongst us, but as a deliberate act of God to make us a community of brothers and sisters jointly involved in the quest for a composite answer to the varied problems of life. Hence, in all we do, we always place man first, and hence all our action is usually joint community-oriented action rather than individualism, which is the hallmark of the capitalist approach. We always refrain from using people as stepping stones. Instead, we are prepared to have a much slower progress in an effort to make sure that all of us are marching to the same tune. Now, I don't know how many of you believe that kind of stuff. I mean, how many people who sort of say, well, our race are angelic and perfect, and we are loving and tolerant, and your race are alien and money grubbing and dirty and cruel. And so it's really, really stark. And it's easy for people to look at white South Africans and say, yeah, well, of course, white South Africans aren't really human beings, because we've historically been guilty of the cardinal sin of the modern age, which is discrimination. Not a lot. And So it's really, really crazy. I mean, look, there is a little grain of truth in what he's saying, which is that what he's describing is the culture of tiny rural communities. And if you've been in a tiny rural community anywhere, whether you're amongst Afrikaners or whatever, or whether you're amongst Englishmen in the countryside, less so, of course, these days. But people are much more open, and because they see the same faces every day, it's much like in the schoolyard that you will tend to get, for the most part, you will get people who just cluster together and they have their friends. These are the neighborhood kids. These are the same faces that you see every day, and it's normal, right? But if a stranger shows up and then you don't know where to place him, right? And you know what this is like in rural communities, where for the first couple of months that you're in there, people have a strange attitude. Either they overreact in one way or another, and it's only when you settle in that you get treated with that kind of trust and assurance that's described. And yeah. So, I mean, look, there is a grain of truth in what the bugger is saying, but he's clearly, yeah, there's a problem. A guy over here, Patrick Vianello, is saying that Verwoerd had the correct philosophy to make the place work. I disagree entirely. I mean, his whole political approach to South Africa was a really dumb compromise. He refused to sacrifice. Let's look at it this way. Let's assume that you can pay any moral cost to build the community that you needed to build, right? And that you just rule out whatever cost, and you just say we're willing to accept it and be absolutely brutal about it and just go, papa, as cruel as you want. Then what you could do in order to sustain the separation of races, oh God, my neighbor's setting off fireworks in the middle of Sunday afternoon. God Allah. Bloody Dutch. Anyway, so what the hell was I saying? So for Verwoerd's policy, he could have gone and said, okay, if we're going to do this Bantustan thing seriously, let's actually give them contiguous territories, sacrifice the land that's required to do so, and just have a contiguous South Africa. I mean, can you imagine him trying to get away with that nonsense? There's no way. I mean, you'd have to remove all welfare and labor protections in white South Africa, right? You'd have to integrate Indian and colored people into the white community. You'd have to give up vast swathes of the Transvaal, some of where very, very hardnekkige boere live, who would absolutely not tolerate this, and they're a key demographic in the political system. It's like if you look at the raw power dynamics of, say, Jan Smuts's government. What are you going to do? Like, people were saying, let's look at it from a liberal perspective. The liberals or socialists or what have you will criticize Smuts and say, well, he should have given all the votes to black people. He shouldn't have cut them out. And you go, okay, well, let's say you do that. Let's say hypothetically you do that. Then even if you manage to coerce members of parliament to do it, the next day you'd have riots in the streets, you'd have a military coup, and everything would go back to normal immediately. There's the opposition to the integration of the natives in South Africa at that point was unanimous. So when you criticize these people for their philosophies, you've got to ask themselves, what balance of powers are they dealing with? And for Steve Biko, he had a justification for what he was doing, which is most of the white students who were joining these student unions were imposing their own view of things, much as I would, for example, in Rhodes Must Fall, right? I'm saying I'm a human being, goddammit, my life has value, blah, blah, blah. And in the old apartheid days, it was like them saying, hang on, I want to negotiate with this I want you to make sure that you're negotiating with this extremely authoritarian and powerful police state on terms that I think are viable as a privileged class in that system. And I use privilege in the technical sense here, from the sense that it privé léger, meaning private law, a law that applies to people as a private category of people, right? White people were privileged by law, just absolutely literally. So I know how much of a buzzword that is today, but it's literally true. Under apartheid, white people were privileged. In the new dispensation, black people are privileged. It's just what it is. That's literally what the word means. So I think what you have to do with all of these people who are thinking about this, how do you judge them? Well, they're very, very difficult. It's very difficult to judge anyone, even someone like. And I'm gonna go out on a limb here and alienate all of the people who came here for right-wing views and say, actually, you're going to have to take a balanced perspective. Yes, nice to see you. Take a balanced perspective of Winnie Mandela. Now, everyone thinks, okay, Winnie Mandela is this horrible, atrocious psychopath who murdered children. Well, you can't really contradict that, but her perspective is that she was tortured by police. She was tortured and raped by the South African police. And afterwards, she was a completely transformed personality. And the way that she engaged in politics was absolutely uncompromising. Okay? Yeah, I don't know if she personally invented it, but she certainly was the biggest and one of the earliest and certainly the biggest proponent of it as a means of torturing traitors. And but the thing is that the tactic that the ANC decided to take, which they adopted from the Vietnamese, was it's called the People's War. And the general idea is that everybody becomes incorporated into the war against the enemy, right? And so you've got to think of it like the Matrix. This is a lot like in the Matrix, where anyone can be an agent. Anyone can be an agent of the system. And imagine, like, it's the white people are the machines, and black people are the people plugged into the Matrix, and some of them are your people. And you're walking around there, and you can't give a damn for how many sort of NPCs you plug, because any of them could be an agent at any time. And you listen to the ANC now, they're absolutely paranoid. It's all like agent this, agent that. And anytime Zuma wants to slow down a legal case, he starts saying, I know people's secrets, people mustn't talk. You know? And I mean, think about it. Like, when you talk about the death of Chris Hani, this is a big fucking shot with everyone, right? So people chill here and they say, okay, Chris Hani, conspiracy. Now, no, it wasn't a conspiracy. There's no one who told Darby Lewis, and I'll get to that Shackler in a minute. But there's no one who, Darby Lewis was in charge. He made that decision, and he had a clear strategic reasoning for doing it. His position was that Hani was an extremely dangerous person that the ANC could not control, and that he had to be taken out, and that hopefully this would, in his mind, this would create enough chaos that they would be forced to postpone the elections, and that by postponing the elections, they would have an all-white election in 1994, and the Conservative Party would take over from the Nats, and they'd be able to preserve apartheid and crush the opposition. That's how he was thinking. Now, from the perspective of white supremacy, that's actually a sound tactic. Now, Chris Hani, this is a man who is absolutely dedicated as a person. Like, if you know his history and his life story, Chris Hani is a man who was absolutely uncompromising about his dedication to the revolution. He was not corrupt in any way. One of the very few people for whom that was true. So in the Wanky campaign, Janus Vos didn't jump the gun. He did as he was supposed to do. Okay. The problem was that they left their license plate on the car, and so someone spotted the license plate, and that goes to the police, and they reported it. So it really is just like not cleaning up the breadcrumbs after you. But Chris Hani was an extremely dangerous man. Look, I'm not going to deny that he was extremely vicious. but he was principled and he was incorruptible, which actually makes him far more dangerous. But you got to remember, the ANC tried to imprison and torture him for speaking out against corruption within ANC ranks back in the 1960s. Okay? And he swallowed that. He swallowed that shit and kept moving in the movement. He walked around with that knife in his back right up until the 1990s. And the thing is that in order to know where Chris Hani would be at what time, in politics, people involved in politics, it's a scary game where everyone's spying on everyone else. And when politics starts to get violent, dude, people who are involved in politics, they keep burner phones and they run interference and they refuse to talk on certain lines. And this is normal in South Africa. Everybody in politics is basically living like under a state of constant terror and surveillance. This is normal in South Africa. They don't talk about it because what are you going to say? It makes you sound like a paranoid loon. But if you speak to anyone who's involved in politics, they have to hide. They have to behave this way. So back in the day when there was lots of serious terror going on, you didn't have like phones and Google and all that kind of nonsense to follow you around, but you certainly had a lot of intelligence, a lot of human intelligence that followed people around. So Darby Lewis would have had to have contacts in the revolutionary movement in order to know where he would be at what time. You can't just park your car outside someone's house, outside a military leader's house, and just wait for him to show up. There's no way you can actually get away with doing that. You can't follow these people either because, you're trying to do this surreptitiously. You have a massive shootout in the middle of the street. It's not going to work out for you, my friend. It's too many variables to deal with. So, so that's the way you've got to think about this. So conspiracies are never one-dimensional. Conspiracies always have multiple dimensions to it, and nobody controls all the variables they hold on to. I mean, look at it doesn't matter how big it is. It doesn't matter how small it is. Every conspiracy contains some fuck up, because you can't control all those variables. And conspiracies it's like I keep telling people, conspiracies are kind of an ordinary phenomenon. It's what politics is made of. You have a lot of stuff that you have to do behind closed doors because people will exploit it. And there's a lot of stuff that is criminal, and that will be done surreptitiously. So you have to be conscientious about that. Do I think Darby Lewis's wife was involved? I don't know, maybe. I wouldn't be shocked, but I don't know. I don't know why she'd need to be. If Chris Hani would have pressured Mandela into making his policies much more radical. And I mean, Mandela was already pretty spendy. He liked spending a lot of money. So the RDP programs that he put in that were like clamped down on when Mbeki got into the power and held the purse strings. They racked up debt. South Africa only really started clearing the debt of the previous government under Mbeki. Mbeki really held on to the fiscus, and actually under his rule, you actually had a decline in unemployment and so on. And like anyone who's around, that time was kind of actually the happiest time to be in South Africa. I mean, look, violent crime was still fine, but there was a dip. There's a little dip in it. And there's those times in the mid-2000s where there didn't really seem to be nearly as much racial animosity. Everything didn't seem to be a hell of a lot of pressure. And, we all thought BEE was stupid and wrong, but it was kind of like, well, it wasn't that intrusive. We could deal with it. It's very different now. But I think that one has to remember that a lot of these communications that people make about the other party during they're a lot clouded. There's a lot of fog of war, and there's a lot of lies that people tell, and there's lots of broken telephone. So if I was to look at, for example, there's this old publication called Reason that doesn't publish anymore, but Alan Paton wrote a thing on black consciousness. Let me just share my screen again so we can my entire screen, Chrome tab, this one. Okay, cool. So there's black consciousness. Now this one's really, really good. So like I like the way he writes about this, because it's actually quite practical considering how much of a liberal idealist he was. I mean, you couldn't accuse the man of being dull. He was a very, very sharp mind. So he says, black consciousness is the direct creation of white arrogance. Pride in having a white skin, I find an inexcusable vulgarity. I'm unable to say the same about pride in having a black skin. I understand the spiritual and psychological necessity for black people to be proud of black skin, even though I regret the reasons for it. Pride in white skin, pride in black skin are for me both vulgarities, but while the first is inexcusable, the second is not and contains elements not vulgar at all. Now, I like the logic of this, because what it's saying is he applies the same basic level moral judgment across the board, and what he's doing is he's then saying, well, whoever has the balance of power, we're going to be a little bit more judgmental of. And I mean, I kind of always have had that mentality myself. The problem is that people find a lot of tricky ways to assert who has power and who hasn't. And I think nowadays this kind of comment would be ridiculous, the one that he's making, because things have moved on. The shoe is on the other foot. Black consciousness is, or certainly appears to be, anxious not to get mixed up with black power. But how long can this pretense be kept up? Black consciousness obviously wants to change the order of things, and rightly so, but you can't change the order of things without power. How long will the young zealots be satisfied with a mush of culture, mysticism, lyricism, and going around saying, "Ooh, haven't I got a lovely skin?" He says, it is not surprising that SASO and Black Consciousness Symposium held in Durban in December of last year have so far directed their specific fire at white liberals. If they were to direct their fire at the government, and boss is the for any foreigners over there, boss was there was a secret service spy network, and the security police, they would not find it so easy to hold conferences. It doesn't require courage to direct one's fire against the politically unarmed. I'm not suggesting that SASO lacks courage, but I don't think highly of its preliminary sallies. Indeed, as I asked Miss Masekela of the December symposium, who said that white liberals are a major stumbling block in the way of black liberation, what should white liberals do? Should they leave the country? Should they keep silent forevermore? Should they go north and be trained as guerrilla fighters? Well, I mean, Breitenbach would have said yes, but... Yeah. Or should they just lie down and die? An intelligent young woman like Miss Masekela should understand that there are some people who call themselves liberals who do not wish to leave their country, who would think it a crime to be silent, and who are not by belief and temperament fitted to become revolutionaries, and who do not wish to die. They are there. They are just as real as Miss Masekela, and some of them, perhaps all of them, are just as honest as she is. Some of them have paid a high price for their beliefs. Miss Masekela must do her thing. They must do theirs. It is as simple as that. They have as much right as she to speak right and work for the country, which is hers too. Now, while I write about the dilemma of SASO, whether to be black power or black consciousness, and though I write with some severity, I do not laugh at it. There are portions of Mr. Biko's address which are brave and honest, and that's why I find the following statement unworthy of him, that blacks have had enough experience as objects of racism not to wish to reverse the tables. Does Mr. Biko really believe that black people in power would have a nobility that white people in power do not? The problem of the future is much more complex than that, and nothing is to be gained by oversimplifying it. I fully realize that Mr. Biko is not concerned with the needs of white people in South Africa, but I am. White South Africans, unless they're going to be driven out of Africa altogether, need to be confronted with the realities of black power and black consciousness, and by the realities of their demands, not by the kind of idealistic platitudes that were once supposed to be the monopoly of liberals. I'm also strongly critical of Mr. Biko's use of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. He says that for liberals, the thesis is apartheid, the antithesis is non-racialism, and the synthesis is very feebly defined. But for black consciousness, the thesis is a strong white racism, the antithesis is black solidarity, and the synthesis is a true humanity where politics have no place. I mean, if you're not laughing now, I mean, crikey. Mr. Biko, this is too much. The synthesis is just as likely to be war. On a personal note, I'm going to close this article on a personal note. Mr. Biko says, I'm using his language that I shouted from London that perhaps apartheid is worth a try. Either Mr. Biko is deceived or he is deceiving. I have never said a word in favor of apartheid in my life. I have fought it not only in the life of my country, but in my own life too. I was not speaking about apartheid at all. I was speaking of those instruments of power which the government has created, namely the territorial authorities. I was urging that they should be used to the full. Mr. Biko regards them all as contemptible and thinks that they should not be used at all because white power created them to give some kind of authenticity to their lie. This is moralistically very grand, but one cannot lay it down as a principle that one must not use one's opponent's moves in order to checkmate him simply because his desire is to subjugate. That would be the end of all sport, political or otherwise. Long before I shouted from London, I wrote that Botha's Hill is reality. So I wrote from Botha's Hill in Reality, that's the magazine, of March of 1971, this paragraph. Reality and the Liberal Party before it are and were totally opposed to the policy of separate development on both moral and political grounds. The goal is, as it always was, one common society whose rights and obligations are shared by all, free of all racial discrimination and upholding fundamental rights and rule of law. But where the government in its pursuit of separate development creates instruments of power that can be used, however imperfectly, for the achievement of progress towards those ends, then the proposition that one should use them is one fully to be considered. It is possible that Steve Biko would think, or would feel obliged to think, that I wrote this paragraph to give some kind of authenticity to the white man's lie, and that in secret I rejoice in this clever way of perpetuating subjugation. I suppose that he is entitled, though it would have to be in some contorted way, to suggest such an opinion. And I fear that is what black consciousness might become, a refusal to believe on principle that any white person can speak the truth. Unless it can overcome this, I predict that it will never have the noble future which Mr. Biko dreams for it, and will become the twin of white nationalism. And what, Mr. Biko, would be the synthesis of that? I mean, that's really just, that's fantastic. It's absolutely prophetic. It's exactly what happened. And I mean, the thing is, what he talks about, however, when you're talking about raw politics, in movements, in ideologies, gaining control of institutions and organizations, there's this phrase in the ancient Indian philosopher Chanakya uses. He also goes by Kautilya, but it doesn't matter. He has a story where he worked for this major king in some part of India, and his advice was not heeded, and he was ejected from the council for objecting to some of the king's reforms and military strategies and so on. So in revenge, he goes over to a rival and tries to take him on. But instead what happens, he gets wiped out, he gets driven into exile, no army, no forces. And he finds himself in a rural village, just nursing his wounds, so to speak. And he looks out across the street and he sees a young woman and her child having breakfast or lunch or whatever it is. And the kid dips his hands into the porridge and burns his fingers. And his mother scolds him and says, "What are you doing putting your fingers into the hot part of the porridge? You eat from the cool side of the porridge. You won't burn your fingers." And so Chanakya goes deeper into exile and meets a king in a foreign country. And that king is Raja Gupta Maurya, who later unifies the entire subcontinent. So, that's the general gist. The idea here is that that a lot of people actually understand this dynamic. So the black radical students in Biko's day were doing what is now called groyping. They were going after people that proposed principles opposing apartheid and said, no, you must take these seriously. You must take these seriously. So you attack the white liberals and say, do you want black liberation? Okay, well then give us power of the student movements. And so that particular position, it's like when you're looking at the Republican, when sort of the Young America First Catholic types started going after Turning Point USA, and saying, well, what are you're doing abortion and gay rights and open borders and all of this kind of stuff. What conservatism is this? That kind of thing. They're demanding that their principles rise to the top of the Republican Party's sort of a manifesto, right? And this sort of principle of challenging power by going after your near allies and treating them as near enemies. This is actually that sort of later term. That's also a comment that you find in Islamic movements. They'll talk about the near enemy and the far enemy. So the near enemy are the secular Arabs who are not enabling the Islamism to gain political power, and the far enemy will be like the United States or Great Britain or whatever. So they see themselves. So you say that these near enemies that are not entirely under your control yet are the tools of the enemy, or they're disloyal, or they're supplicant, or whatever. And everyone understands this logic. This is a very, very sort of easy logic to understand, because those people already have some degree of loyalty to you. They already have some degree of loyalty to principles you share. And by using new logically consistent applications of those principles that compel them to new behaviors, you can steer the group that's near you but is not as radical. And the thing is that this can count from any single position. There is no natural center anywhere. There's simply whoever holds power. And so you can see what people can call radical centrism is really just whatever suits what the government and the ruling class who share the government's interests want to do. That would be radical centrism. But the government, over the broad swathe of history, you can have governments that are left-wing, right-wing, whatever you want, and still have a so-called radical centrism under any of those parameters. For some reason, new comments are not loading. British Empire used the Uitlander political grievance as a reason to invade. I don't the same I was saying the USA will fall the same way. I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I think that what's going to make them fall is internal differences. It's not going to be and look, there's always going to be foreign interests that are causing a lot of problems. But what's going to make South Africa fall is actually internal ethnic strife. It's not going to be very interesting. It really is just going to be ethnic tensions, group security. The thing is that minorities know that they are not secure, that their interests are not secure, that their political rights are not secure. And that's going to cause problems, because you have to have some security for these things. So this would be where I would go with that. Kruger gave an ultimatum. Kruger didn't bother trying to control his borders. He didn't bother. So that's like, he just kept ratcheting up the regs, the length of time. It's like prison. Everyone resorts to race. Only when life really becomes like a prison does that actually happen, as far as I'm concerned. If things are going really well and society's really mobile and dynamic, those differences start evaporating. They start merging and changing. But when things fall apart, then everyone sort of panics and falls into categories again. And this is an interesting thing, because there's so I mean, because you've got to look for some sort of form of allegiance. If you're really panicking, let's say the economy completely collapses, who's the first person you go to? You go to family. Let's say you haven't talked to your cousin for a million bloody years. You're going to go to your cousin because he's there. Let's say, I mean, if you've got like a political club, they're actually not even those people are not going to be the first people you go to. These are people who will share every principle with you. You will not go to them first. You'll go to the people. People trust those who are more genetically similar, but they don't when they don't. It depends entirely on how much certainty they have in the future. And this is what you see with the people who are more upper class, is they're more detached from this. And you will actually get a lot of working class people who, if they have stable access to jobs, they're fine. And even people who in fairly precarious positions in society can be fairly non-racially guided. But it's whether or not they think the system itself is in trouble. If they think the system itself is in trouble, or that the system itself threatens them, then they turn to the group grievances. And that's where the radicalization comes from, because radicalization, it says, you must know that strong society is built on trust and cohesion, which is fun. See, now, that's true. But that's true of Singapore. Singapore's, very multicultural. So it's not just one factor. There are multiple factors that you have to put into play here. And so race is always going to be a factor. Of course, it's always going to be a factor, but it's one of many factors. And no, I'm not being naive here. I'm saying that this is just what is the case. And the thing is, there will always be change. There will always be flux. Things will always return to states of insecurity and disequilibrium, to use the Sorosian term. And it's, how has Brazil maintained a non-racial society? They haven't. They get along fine sometimes, and they have trouble other times. They do better than other nations for reasons that I can't touch. I mean, like, as any political scientist will tell you, Brazil is not for beginners. I'll say the same for South Africa or India or any of these big, really messy societies. The big countries are not for beginners, So I think the thing is to pay attention to the BLM protests in Brazil now. Yeah, there are. But Brazilians are funny because they're really interesting. There's a lot more interest from them in the English conservatives and in reactionary thought than I thought would be normal for that country. Which is really, really interesting. Look, people who go on about caste systems, like, the thing is, modern society is far too fluid for you to talk about this kind of stuff as a staple anymore. You can do a caste system for a little while, and it's going to unravel. The only way you could maintain any caste system in the modern world is if you did some kind of sakoku, some kind of like total national isolation. In fact, the only way you could stably reproduce any long-term system is by doing that. The US is the closest thing that any country, the US and China, shall I say, the closest thing countries come to really having properly isolated bubbles. They don't do a lot of comparison. They really do live in their own system. And caste systems are not stable. People will rebel. Not because rebellion is a necessity at all times, but because eventually someone will come along who can benefit from destabilizing the class system. And so Oh yeah, Kristen DeWitt. Yeah, that's a very good observation. BLM and Biko. The thing is that South African black nationalists were strongly influenced from a very, very early time by W.E.B. Du Bois or Du Bois. I don't know which way I want to go with. The Chinese crunch the minorities. Yeah, because the Chinese have. I'm not even going to go into that one. It's just that's going to get too long and hairy. But the Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, big influence. And these people, these two guys, I mean, Du Bois was very big on picking up on romantic nationalism and race nationalism from Europe, from Germany. And so you've got that sort of thinking that you recognize in the German National Socialists appearing in American black nationalism. And so, and yeah, as you heard from my essay, I referenced Malcolm X. So Malcolm X has got that whole sort of white liberals criticism. That thing goes into Biko. And if you listen to Thomas Sowell, he talks about white liberals as well. I think almost everyone understands that white liberals, if you ignore the word liberal in white liberals, they're a certain class of people. You know them. They've got a certain income. They've got a certain, work background, skill training, all of that kind of stuff. They're a certain sector of society, and we recognize them. And it goes back to what I was saying about, the degree to which the prison rules apply is the degree to which life feels like a prison. So these people are people who live in luxury. They have a lot of freedom. They have a lot of liberties. They don't play at a high degree of power. So the upper classes are competing very, very strenuously for status and so on. It's extremely competitive when you get up at the top. And the same with politics. It's vicious. But for people who are a bit below that, right, there's a lot of there's a nice creamy middle. A lot of people can live in. That's where the white liberals live, because they're used to peaceful neighborhoods where people are polite to each other. At worst, they're passive aggressive. They're used to going to schools where their children are taught and guaranteed a future. They're used to all of the nice things that suburbia can bring. And so they're going to be tolerant, and they're going to be, so on and so forth. And these things affect how they think. But they still have class dynamics, and they still feel themselves as being like better than, because they have that upward mobility, and they feel like we're better than the lower classes, and we kind of want to look more classy. And so they demonstrate their adherence to their finer adherence to the prevailing moral attitudes of the time. So if Christian charity is big, the middle class will give a lot to charity. And right now the big things are democracy and privilege. So they show how much they trust their fellow man to make the right decisions at the ballot box, and they show how much they're conscious of the fact that they are very privileged and the less off are so very heavy suffering, which they are. I mean, let's not even pretend. I mean, black South Africans do kind of have a shitty deal of things. But the white liberals don't engage with it honestly. They do it as part of like a group signaling game. They've learned these things, and even as young people, they'll engage in them instinctively because they know that the status signals are part of how you make yourself attractive to the opposite sex. And so, and there are people who are creative and intelligent who can buck these and do like put ironic distance, or who are charming enough to succeed in the sexual marketplace even while shunning the prevailing norms. But for most people, for most men, I should say, that pressure to conform, or at least advertise a pretense of conformity, is kind of a thing. And like, we know that men tend to be more sort of not conservative. How should I put it? We tend to defect more. We tend to have a more independent-minded thing. but we'll still pretend to be less edgy than we are, or more edgy than we are, depending on which mating strategy we've cobbled together as young men. So, whereas women tend to be slightly more conformist, women aren't people. We're both playing the same game, but we're playing them differently, So women will be more conforming because they'll be vicious at policing each other, because you maintain the standards because women maintain the standards by which the sexual game is played. And so women who are more powerful will police the signals that are accepted by other women around them. Yeah, so it's very complicated. There's different strategies, and of course these are broad generalizations. There's always people who fall outside the boundaries, blah blah blah. All usual caveats apply. The Volvo is right. Free thinking is the most manly trait you can have. It tends to have that look. But here's the thing: the guys who are real tricky, the guys who are really successful, they manage to do both at the same time. So they show themselves as being highly dynamic and free thinking, but also at the same time upholding the deepest expression of the true values of the society in which they live. So clever guys don't ever completely defect. No smart person ever completely defects from society. That requires complete insanity, because we live in society. That's like a fish defecting from the water. You can only reject so much of society at a time. And so you kind of have to drag it along instead of running away from it. And that's not just a sexual marketplace thing. This is just generally living in society stuff. So, women rely more on society. They're evolved to keep the group together. The more powerful a man becomes, the less loyal he is to the group. Managerial elite toaster. I think that is not entirely true. I think that once you have enough power, in order to maintain it, you have to demonstrate some kind of loyalty to the group. You have to demonstrate it, right? In order to, whether it's real or fake or whatever, your appearance of loyalty to your subjects as a leader, your followers as a leader, is really, really important. It's how you keep them around. If you look like you're betraying them for a second, that power's gone, right? So powerful men don't defect. Powerful men define what it means to defect. That's what it is. You can tell, like when people say there's no evidence for X, there's no evidence for Y, you can tell what the position of power is, because the power is defining the null hypothesis against which all evidence must compete for approval. So that's what power is. Power defines what defection is. It defines the criteria of loyalty. Okay. I tend to like Shack Dweller saying, I tend to like Dawkins' idea of the selfish gene, how genes push you be successful in passing your disease genes onto the next generation, so you are inherently coded to be self-preserving. I mean, aside from the spelling error, I do know what you're saying. There's an interesting thing actually here with Dawkins, because he says, so he's the guy who created memes as well. Hey, he created the idea of memes, but the thing that he sort of doesn't apply his whole idea of the selfish gene to the meme. Try and extend this as like the selfish meme. The meme lives as a parasite that that sort of utilizes the host to extend it. And he doesn't even believe this. He looks at he completely ignores ideology in everyday life, and he just thinks, well, religion just isn't true. And believing things that aren't true are not evolutionarily efficacious. And so therefore, and I'm just thinking like, yeah, but religion survived for flipping millions of years. It kept people together and helped them do things. And Christianity achieved the most amazing heights of any civilization, up until the present day. And so what is this man? What is this man smoking? He's clearly not on that. And what's really hilarious? Well, it's not hilarious. It's sad. Him watching old churches crumble, and then he turns to the woke crowd and he thinks, you know, it would be nice if we could keep our churches, and it would be nice if we could keep our civility and keep the culture that we grew up in. But all of that is Christian culture. You pulled the pin on which your whole culture was hanging. You can't expect it to stay hanging up, you know? And I mean, of course, he's coming like 2 centuries too late with all of this bollocks. You know, the French Revolution already fired the lethal shot. Christian civilization has been bleeding out for a long time. But yeah, it's yeah, I don't know what to say about that. But yeah, I know I skipped a couple of comments here. I like that I don't have enough followers to have too many comments to follow. I think that's good. I've not directed my attention to educating myself regarding Obi Kenobi. Okay. Regarding the necessity of my function in the community, I wrongly focus solely on generating income. Balance is tricky. No. Look, how you behave in the community kind of flows from your economic function to some extent. It depends what you're doing. I mean, look, if you have 1 or 2 things where you're socializing with people in your neighborhood, you don't need to do much more than that. Just so long as you're still like meeting people around you on a daily basis, and you know who they are, and so on and so forth. That's good. Things will grow from that. Some of those people you won't like. Some of those people you will like. Just knowing who they are, being aware of them. It's easier in South Africa because neighborhood watches are very, very serious. And so people know everyone in their neighborhoods a lot more than they used to. It used to be that white neighborhoods were very, very isolated and very, very sort of atomized. But now you really do have to be paying attention. And so people know each other in their neighborhoods quite well. Because it's difficult to avoid it. Especially, I mean, even if you have private security in the area, private security can do only so much, and they're quite expensive. So, yeah, I think a lot of people, as long as you're participating in some of those basic things, you'll be fine. I don't think it requires some kind of hectic maneuver. Making money is a really noble fucking goal. Don't turn it down. As long as as long as you're not screwing anyone to get that money, it's good. It's good. Don't shun it. You know, you need that money for your family. You'll need that money for a rainy day. Don't shun. Where we go. The communist Chinese government has this year started pursuing the eugenic policies of improving the quality of the population. Don't for a second think it's just the Chinese. Don't for a second think it's just the Chinese. Other people will be doing it, but they'll be doing it on the down low. And, you know, it'll be people who are pushing. Look, the sort of Fabian political culture that we have in the transatlantic community is very, very strong, and they know that eugenics is like a dirty word, but I don't believe for a second that they're avoiding it. You're already sort of seeing articles coming down now about people doing what did that fella call it? He called it velvet eugenics, where you test for the genetic defects in your kids and then you abort them based on that. Yeah, it's kind of a big thing now. I don't think it's going to stop at China. Although China, they probably got a bit of a head start, and they have far less moral compunction. They really don't have much moral compunction as a nation, and I don't think it's. I think it's largely because the system doesn't allow for it. It's extremely ruthless. You got to remember, Chinese people aren't, robots or anything. If you want to see what their culture is kind of more like, you look at them in Indonesia. they were the vanguard for fighting for Indonesian independence, and they got eaten alive for it. I mean, not literally, but there were a million of them slaughtered in 1975 by the Indonesians. So it's kind of a big deal. Valchim Lavanya Buata. Really enjoy your talks and documentaries, listening in the background, making supper for the kids and husband. That sounds extremely wholesome. I'm very jealous. So yeah, that's great. Thank you. Rob, do you think that we have a good chance to push back against the Globo Homo Cathedral? I still cringe when I hear that phrase. I just call it the transatlantic community, because that's kind of what it is. It's a transatlantic economic and political community that shares institutions and so on. It shares some values, but I think most of those values are flexible and instrumental. So, yeah. A good chance to push back against them, though. Look, we really are at the final battle. I think that what we've got is a situation where if Trump loses his legal battle, which let's not bullshit here, it's narrow. This is very like Lord of the Rings territory of, oh my goodness, someone's going to kill the hobbits and then this is all over. Do you know what I mean? So the reason that Trump is obviously the champion of anti-globalism. And he's an extremely flawed character, and I really wish people would. I really wish it wasn't necessary for people to have such adulation for him to show loyalty to this particular movement. Because honestly, I think, look, let's say you're a communist. Let's say you really believe in communism, right? You look at what the Great Reset is. How can you for a second believe that those are the good guys? Doesn't matter if you're on the right or the left. The only people who really would ever be invested in something like the Great Reset are parasites and idiots. Everyone else, whether they're on the right or the left, should be looking at this thing and saying, fuck no. And Trump, unfortunately, happens to be the last champion against it in global politics. You know? I mean, I haven't looked at India or Brazil too hard, but I mean, Brazil, how much clout does Bolsonaro have in the grand scheme of things? They're already talking about targeting him as like a climate something threat, you know? So what if the majority of society happens to be parasites by definition? I disagree. I think that you just simply cannot actually have a society that's even half parasite. It's not possible. And I mean, look, you've got to be honest. All of us have been parasites to some degree in our lives at certain points, and we have to be. We have to sort of depend on others from time to time. And I don't mean through the state. It's just part of life. There's always going to be someone in the family who's struggling. There's always going to be someone who's dealing with these things. So, I mean, I use nasty, edgy words, but I don't want, don't take it too pejoratively. Yeah, I think Shaq Dollar's right. Most society is just naive and oblivious. But they're naive, even oblivious in specific ways that are determined by where they live, what they do, what ethnicity they have, all of these things. What values were inculcated to them in them as children by the institutions that they were part of. There are a lot of factors to play, and you always have to be careful, because like you're going to want to use one lens to solve everything, and that lens might be extremely powerful in this circumstance or that circumstance. But sorry, I hate to use the word lens. It's actually really bothered me. But it's become such a well-used thing. If you want to understand things, you got to just go, which factor is the strongest here, and how much of it is ameliorated by other factors. So you just think of it as a lot of different things that are pulling one way or pushing the other. And sometimes they're race incentives, sometimes there's class incentives, sometimes that, God, I sound like an intersectionalist. But you don't have to do it in the dumb way that they're doing it. You can talk about sexual marketplace. You can talk about genetic factors if you want to get funny, if you want to get edgy. But any of these tools, whether they're evolutionary, whether they're economic, whether they're contingent, whether they're like something like some sort of arbitrary meme intrusion that's stirring everything up, it's all going to it's always going to be multiple things. So adjustable lenses, yeah. You need a lens to see the whole spectrum. The whole rainbow. Yeah. Have you heard of the jolly heretic Edward Dutton? I have. I've bumped into him a few times. I don't listen to him too much. He seems to be, I don't know, he's a bit too, it feels a bit forced sometimes. Do you know what I mean? Like using all of these like buzzwordy sort of cliched sort of what's up and coming, and trying to find like a deep moral or scientific justification for like a spontaneous short-term fashionable meme. That's the way that left-wingers do. They find something that has temporary political contingency, and then they dive into the literature to find some justification for believing it. And I don't like, don't do that, man. Like, look at what I'm doing. I'm taking, like, this is what I think people should be doing if they're trying to figure things out. Is, look, if you're a politician and you're trying to do polemic, do that. But you have to remember the facts, and you have to be able to recognize and accept that even your enemies were human beings that had talent and did things. Do you know what I mean? Because if you can't face them with some kind of degree of honor, it actually corrupts you and corrupts your perspective and your ability to process that information that you might otherwise learn. And so, I mean, for example, if you is he not doing that? I don't know. I haven't checked him out in a very long time. I don't know what Edward Dutton's done. I've watched a few. I mean, like, I don't know. I don't really know. I can't say he's right or wrong about everything. I just noticed he was doing there's a certain pattern to what he was doing, and it sort of put me off. I'm sure he has plenty of interesting things to say, but his style is a little bit sort of, I just don't enjoy it. I'm sure he's clearly a smart guy, but yeah, look, I don't have a lot of taboos anymore. I'm happy to entertain ideas written by left-wingers. I'm happy to entertain ideas written by right-wingers. I happen to think that the demotic economics, that is left-wing economics, demotic economics is wrong. I happen to think that victimhood is a bad way to fight any political battle. I think it causes you to degenerate if you're constantly presenting yourself as a victim and saying, pity me, woe is me. You learn to acquire influence through degrading yourself. And I don't think that that's very healthy. And I don't, not as a group, not as anything. And this is kind of why Steve Biko isn't so dumb. Like, he's wrong about a whole bunch of stuff, but he's right about one thing. And it's not like he's original in this. This is something he's inherited from a lot of other black nationalist thinkers. He says that you've got to be able to have pride and self-respect. Pride, I don't think so, not necessarily, but self-respect and like a limit to what you'll tolerate. And you don't say, oh, I'm a victim, pity me. You say, I will not tolerate this. I will not take this. And that's a different thing. That's a very different thing. Because otherwise you end up you just immiserate yourself, and you immiserate others by making everything pathetic. And I don't believe in that. I don't think that's good. So I'm just going to poke around at a few more questions quickly, and then we're going to finish off soon. So Shakhtar, ends shouldn't justify the means. Well, I mean, that's an age-old conundrum, that one. Do the ends justify the means? How much are you willing to sacrifice? Is the sacrifice worth it? I mean, that's very difficult. I think the second you try and draw a rigid line and say, these means are always justified and only these means, yeah, you're going to have problems. I'm not a free speech absolutist. I'm not averse to violence. I'm not averse to anything like that. My position on any topic is kind of like, it's what Mandela was using. That his I think I could do a stream on this at some point, is Mandela's Rivonia trial thing, because he says something very interesting there. He presents this argument of saying that he's never supported terrorism, and that's true. Umkhonto we Sizwe had a very, very specific strategic mandate, right? But what he says is that he will achieve what he intends to achieve by any means necessary. And there's a clear distinction between by any means necessary and by any means available. Now, the failure to draw that distinction leads people to do things that are obviously morally evil. But the failure to, or it also draws the failure to use necessary means. So yeah, I think the point is to actually just maintain perspective and maintain an appropriate sort of thing. That's what it is. Just be balanced and be appropriate. So Japan is slowly dying out. Kinda. I mean, my sort of primitive intuitions tell me it's something like the mouse utopia. You know, you cram everyone into these boxes in the big city. Of course, they're going to get depressed and stop breeding. Get them outside, get them exercising, get them doing things together. But where are you going to do it? Largest conurbation in the history of the world. Everything concrete. Yay. Yes, great streamer, Bunny. Welcome to my channel anytime if you'd like to chat with me about stuff. That depends on what the content of your channel is. Because it does depend. It does depend on what that content is. I hope you understand what I mean by that. Marabani, do you think that these are the most troubling times globally since 1945 and South Africa since 1994? No, I don't think so, because we aren't risking nuclear war at the moment. I think that's about it. I'm not going to say anything more complicated than that. I mean, the risk of nuclear war is real for decades. It's been fairly chilled for a while. I mean, it hasn't gone away. There's still a chance that it'll happen. And the Chinese are perfectly willing to entertain sort of limited exchange, to use Kissinger's term that was reappropriated for that film. What's it called? How I Learned to Love the Bomb. Dr. Strangelove. So Chinese perfectly capable of entertaining that idea. So I don't know. I don't know. For South Africa, most troubling times since 1945. Possibly. I think since 1994. Yeah, no, you're right. Because the current system is kind of falling apart. Everyone questions it. Everyone's kind of doing this thing of like, did Mandela sell out? Was Mandela a good guy? Certainly, there are plenty of reasons to think that he wasn't the angel that everyone made him out to be. I don't think he was. He was a real man, and he was in many ways a great man in the sense that I used it before. Even if he wasn't a good man, he certainly did achieve a hell of a lot. And the arc of his life really reads like a classic, like, hero's journey. you know. So he's a really interesting guy to talk about, and people want to spit on Nelson Mandela. Don't get those motherfuckers at all. Like, this is a man who really did live a life and took massive risks and did massive things. And whatever compromises he made to the end of his life, those are worth looking into too. I think, there's a lot to learn from it. So I'm just going to run up until 2 hours, and then if there are any comments left, sorry for you. That guy on YouTube did experiments with people where they got put in situation, leave switch to change train direction, and kill 2, leave it to kill 10. Oh, trolley. Oh, I hate trolley problems. I mean, it's like the ultimate illustration of why ethical thought experiments are bunkum. They don't tell you anything about the real world. You have to look at actual decisions in context to learn what they're like, because life is far more complicated than sitting with a switch on the rails. And these are people who sit and make utilitarian decisions like, oh, I'm sure it's the Rona. But no, I was thinking of someone recently, it's like, who drew a trolley problem to express how they thought about the big international lockdown. So on the one track is someone's the track that the train would normally go on has someone saying there is no train, and then like people saying like buy Bitcoin and masks don't work and all of that kind of stuff. And then on the other track there's nobody, and so the person is sitting with the lever is going, well, do I kill all of the irritating people, or do I do something which doesn't hurt anybody? And so that's the frame through which a lot of like pro-establishment people are looking at it. They really do believe that something like lockdown has no moral cost whatsoever. My position on this is that clearly it does, and you can't be doing it forever. You have to give it up and just tolerate the fact that I can see that COVID is clearly a little bit more lethal than the flu, but it doesn't seem to be by much, and that doesn't seem to justify what's being done by any means. And as far as I'm concerned, this thing has to go, and we have to just cope with it, whatever the real figures are going to be. It's just not worth it. It really just isn't worth it. But that's my utilitarian calculation here. Have I read Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill? No, I haven't actually. I've heard that name. I don't know what that book is though. Can a government claim part of the moon? Well, I guess. Although it'll entirely depend on what it can keep. Everything comes down. It really does work like claiming, but I think in my mind, claiming new territory probably works a lot like kids claiming seats in a cafeteria. It's who claims what and who can defend what. If you're a big, nasty puss, you can walk up to a guy and say, hey, you're sitting in my seat. And he either gets up or he fights you. And you figure it out. So the moon is just, colonialism 2.0, that whole vibe. Outward expansion of the fuel of empires. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, like, you can imagine if Europe didn't expand outwards and had to keep fighting its silly battles amongst itself. You'd be having basically that Napoleon would be happening every generation. It's the existence of the global market that allows it to have some outlet. What if you can't express your vindication in the convictor's language? I'm not sure what that means. I assume you mean what if you can't express your political desires in a language that the people that hold power understand? Look, politics involves a whole bunch of universal symbolic language. The show of force, the word no translates into every language. I don't think you have to be too complicated about this. It's just if something sucks, just say you're not going to accept it. Just as a general rule, that you don't have to be too complicated. Although if you're negotiating amongst elites, complex communication is a must. And so you do have to develop language, symbolic language, literal language, to deal with things and to communicate them in compressed ways. And that's necessary. And rallying people, all you need to do is to find a symbol that they understand. That the people who you're pulling together to work together, they have to understand it. That has to resonate with them. Communication is about getting involved in really fine communication is an elite's job. And an elite is, well, technically, I'm kind of, by doing what I'm doing, I'm claiming a position as an elite. By getting involved in talking about politics at all and talking about political strategy at all, that's claiming a position as an elite. And once you're in that game, you're just in it. And yeah, that's what it is. Shack Dweller, please read last comment and thoughts. What did you say? Oh, right, the trolley problems. Samson option, ensuring we don't make any stupid moves. Samson option only works as Samson option is a real, like, Schrodinger's cat type thing. It's, you have to both mean it and not mean it. The opponent has to have no idea whether or not you're actually going to use it, and you can't get away. It's yeah. You have to make the gamble really nasty for them, but I don't know. Content in my channel is about cultural war stuff, inspiring people not to be blackpilled, giving them a sphere platform to talk. The theme of my channel is not to give up. Oh, that's very nice. That sounds really good. Christian de Witt, not to mention that apartheid South Africa was a nuclear power. That it was. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about the nukes still being buried somewhere, that the Otopis know where it is, and I don't believe that for a second. The distinction between terrorism and violence is the desperation experienced and perceived by the ones contemplating force. No, terrorism is a very specific thing. Terrorism is when you enact extreme violence on some target in order to manipulate an audience. So you've got to see terrorism as a triangle where you have terrorist, victim, audience, right? That's how you understand terrorism. It's an objective, strategic tool. Okay, anyone can use it. State can do terrorism. I have a big fat book there on the bottom of my shelf about state-sponsored terrorism under the apartheid regime. Anyone can do terrorism. It's a tactic. So when someone says one man's freedom fighters, another man's blah, 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 yeah, Tlogela daai ding. Mandela had dark flaws. Well, everyone has dark flaws. I'm sure I do. Imagine putting me in control of the military. Like, do you really think that I'm the guy to do this? I promised you I would upload a video yesterday. I still haven't fucking clipped it to upload it. This is the guy you want to be in charge of these kinds of things. Incompetence. The coping mechanisms people in power who have competence flaws have to do in order to stay in power are enormously damaging. I mean, jeepers. You know, because in order to stay in power, you have to coerce people to accept your incompetence. So you don't want people who've got competency issues running the show. You have to fix them before you get there. If you are naive, maybe, but they fabricate people through media. I don't know what that's in response to. He became a good man after prison. I don't know about that. I think he's still a flawed fella. I think he's got. I think he's just a complex guy who has a lot of different things going. Yeah, I don't want to box him into anything. I just think he's a really big, important man who did great things, positive and negative, and he deserves to be treated with He deserves to be treated with the same respect as any historical figure. So, and there are things that you can learn from him. There's things that you're not going to know what to do. Pointless talking about Mandela in terms of today's affairs. No. You see, because he's an extremely powerful symbol. So people who are powerful symbols need to be discussed. They need to be treated. And the more you treat them objectively, the more nuance you inject into your society, the more humane you make your society's political discussions. Okay? It takes all that emotion of like, this person's good, that person's evil, lowers the temperature and allows you to have reasonable discussions and negotiations about rights and powers in society. So I think I'm going to have time for one more question, so I'm going to try and pick one that is very meaty, if I can. So let's see. Okay, that one, I don't understand that comment at all. Best part of this collapse is the price of books being cheap. That's a good tip. I'll take that in. I haven't been looking. No, I still pirate things, you see. Okay, Mandela was responsible for the Shell House Massacre. Yes, I cover that in one of my little documentary type essay thingy video things. Managerially toaster mudnidi liusa balkrapni. Aha, well. Cyril for Biko. Oi, that one really rubbed me the wrong way. I can. Also, show Captain. Keyboard spamming is hard work. I don't mind if the questions are good. They're good. Have I watched World War II in color? I'd say some political terrorism. Christoph Smuts physically removed communist debaters over economic issues. Yeah, young. We'll figure out a way of neutralizing them, but I don't think. Physically remove is actually quite nice, because I do like the idea of, let's say you have an independent country, you just exile them. You don't have to execute people or torture them or put them in prison forever. Exile. Although the internet's kind of a problem. You'd have to have like a great firewall option as well if you're doing it. But when does the left go too far? Ooh. So someone's asking the old Jordan Peterson question. I'm actually going to go with this one as the last question. So Jordan Peterson says we don't know when the left has gone too far. And I think that this is essentially his problem, is he still thinks in terms of a political spectrum, right? So you got to just cut that out. There's no political spectrum. The left is a singular tradition. Okay? Exiles eventually lead to mercenaries. Oh, this is very distracting, because that's actually a... Never mind. So anyway, so the left going too far. The issue is that the left is already too far. Their very existence is predicated on social values that are negative and morally wrong, right? And so the extent to which left principles prevail in society is the extent to which your society will be thrown into decay. Now, people will say, okay, well then what about right principles and, all of the slaughter and blah, blah, blah. Look, the thing about race nationalism, that kind of like a puritanical version of it that you tend to get with like the Nazis and so on, is that is actually born out of the left tradition, as in French Revolution. The same way that the French made their nation one people with one language, homogenizing every aspect of their culture. That's something. So Hitler is a successor to the French Revolution, right? So this whole this is not to say that ethnicity and the ties that bind are unimportant, blah blah blah, but it's saying you have to let go of it. You have to let go of your attachment to that and look at what works, what can allow you to survive and carry on and give your people a future now. And you've got to let go of those radical revolutionary dreams of purity and perfection and heaven on earth, whatever they are. You really have to get rid of them. If the left was not deranged, the Nazis would not feel the need to deal with them. Well, I mean, I understand that argument. That's not my point. It's not my point at all. If you ask yourself when the left has gone too far, you have to look at what the left is. And this is kind of something that Curtis Yarvin kind of nailed down almost. I mean, he's kind of right, he's kind of wrong. Where he said, what did he say? He said it's demotic. It's demotic morality. It's the idea that truth comes from the people. And I think he's only half right, because certainly the principle of consultation is a universal one in all politics, whether you're dealing with a populist leader or a populist dictator, a monarch, a clerical system, or anything. You have to consult with the people or they will rebel if they feel like they're not included into the decision making on some level. It doesn't have to be elections or whatever, but elections are just a very efficient way to do it. Oh, did Engels not state? Oh, good God Almighty! I'm not having this conversation now. But my point is more that if you want to understand, I think Engels might have been referring to the way that you get. So I don't know if you've read Baruch Spinoza's work. So Baruch Spinoza was a Spanish Jew who retired to the Netherlands. Extremely great, big shot philosopher, and so there's a lot of tendency to stereotype him as being like the archetypal Jewish philosopher, which is not it. But Spinoza's theory is that so what you're trying to do is your inner self is the self-determined, eternally immortal engine, right? I can't remember what the technical term is that he used, but basically you live to self-perpetuate, right? But you're trying to be free from desire, and desire is this thing that intrudes upon you. Think of this in like a Buddhist sense. Buddha says we're trapped in the world and we have to deal with intrusions from the senses. But while Buddha says that the way you become free of that is you just accept it as a fact, you accept the theodicy of reality. Spinoza says, no, what has to happen is that those have to be satisfied so they go away. And that's a very distinct thing. So I don't think he's the first. I don't think that he's, and frankly, there's a lot more of perverted Christianity in the left than there is of Judaism, frankly. So I don't think that characterization is accurate. But what it is you're trying to, what the left does is they say that all of the existent, there is no limit, there should be no limits in the world. The point of politics for the left is to liberate human beings from all physical limitations. And the perversions that are required to do that are extraordinary. And a lot of it will succeed. But it's not even about justifying greed or anything like that. It is, overcoming our material nature would be roughly right. And there's occasionally you'll get marriages of leftist ideas with various different combinations of things, and then you'll end up with these different models of revolutionary politics, whether they're liberal or nationalist or communist or what have you. And the way that you escape the left, the spiral of leftism, is to just as Hitchens used that fantastic phrase. No, it wasn't Hitchens. It was Philip Gurevich who said, "It is not a slippery slope; it is a greased precipice over which they wish to push you." So you don't even start. What you just go is you say, "Look, this is reality. This is what we're dealing with. This is it. We have these real constraints, and this is what we are determined to do in reality." And that does require a lot. There's a lot that the human will can do. but it cannot achieve heaven on earth. Politics will always exist. Division will always exist. And yeah, almost sounds like a hint of modern statism. I would 100% agree with that. The foundations of the leftist movement that were provided by the Martinists, the Rosicrucians, and the Freemasons, people like Voltaire and Rousseau and so on, they had an enormously profound shaping influence on modernist maneuver. So look, this is the thing. I mean, if I'm going to bring it full circle, it's the thing about Steve Biko and people like him is they really believe they can get to an end of history, right? They believe that they can solve this and create a perfect society that will endure without suffering. Make society humane. Society is as humane as there's not an infinite variance for how humane society can be. There's a fair bit, but there's not all that much. And someone who like Steve Biko, he will never accept the struggle. He'll never accept the struggle. He's constantly trying to break the wheel. The wheel doesn't break. We're humans. This is where we are, right? Not in the physical world can you ever escape the wheel. So you have to accept it, and you struggle for what's right while you're here, and then that's it. That would be my position on the matter. Try to be humane as much as possible. I would encourage. If you scorn sympathy, you scorn empathy, because you think people are less than you, I think you make yourself weak as well. But I mean, that's that. It's very nice chatting to you, but I think hurt of Jesus. Okay. I believe the civil rights movement was a scam by integration. He believes integration to be infiltration. It essentially killed Black Wall Street in the USA. Well, that would be a very pertinent question. That's a really interesting perspective, but I'd have to call up on that one some other time. But thanks everyone for dropping by and asking questions. It was really kiff. If you think there's something that you'd like me to cover, whether it's from my blog or whether it's just from something in general, I am on Twitter and I do a fair bit of banter. And if I see something interesting, I can always do a thing on it. I don't know. Have a good Sunday, everybody. Oh, come on.